Hello again, everyone. We now come to a rather important chapter, the bayonet attack. Now, this is a feared opening line, and I think might even be the reason a lot of people don't play the King's Indian. I don't think they've actually studied it in depth, but they just feel the name is so scary, and vague recollection that Kramnik played a very nice game against Kasparov many years ago in the bayonet. Now, don't worry, it doesn't refute the King's Indian. And in fact, in my couple of games with Black against Vladimir Kramnik, he did not play the bayonet against me. In fact, he went for some sidelines and avoided any proper King's Indian theoretical battle entirely. This is similar to the 991 Mar del Plata stuff that we've been looking at, but white is going to break immediately on the queen side with b4. Now, of course, the idea is to play c5. This break is key. So I'm recommending that we react with a5, immediately damaging white's structure. It's not the main line. The main line is play knight h5, but there I feel that white needs, the black needs to memorize some long lines to hold in slightly worse positions. Not really what we're aiming for with the King's Indian. I think a5 gives us more play. We'll come and have a look. So we have the normal moves, the classical King's Indian, the same start as normal, and b4 immediately, the bayonet attack. Now here I recommend to push with a5. Basically, I think a5 is the most principled move against b4. We immediately highlight the problem that white can't play a3 as ab, ab, and the rook is hanging on a1. So white has to make a concession. Playing b5 is something of a disastrous concession in my book, even though Magnus Carlsen played something similar in a rapid game recently against Adyiban. I don't understand the idea whatsoever. After b6, white has closed to the queen side, which is where he's attacking, and given us a wonderful square on c5 for our knight, ready to pop back to d7 into c5, and we still can play our kingside attack that we know so well by this point of f5 and attacking over on the king side. I'm not sure what white's hope is. So there are two different ways of dealing with a5, and they're actually likely to transpose to one another. Bishop a3 is the most common move. When move orders start becoming quite confusing around here, I recommend us to simply take on b4. But we could start with b6 too. Then white normally takes on a5. And has to rook takes a5, bishop b4, rook back. We've reached exactly the same position as a takes b4, bishop takes b4, b6 immediately, but with an extra tempo played by both sides. These kind of transitions are quite confusing. And so if you're relying on move number to remember your theory, then you're going to be in a bit of trouble here, because both sides, white and black, can choose how many tempi to reach the same position. White can play ba immediately, or this bishop a3, for example, as well, as us having the choice of playing ab or waiting for white to play ba. Just something to be aware of if you're trying to remember your theory by move number. But we'll take, bishop takes. So the strategic battle here is white trying to break with c5, as usual. The king side is for us and the queen side is for white. But there are a couple of differences with the knight still being on f3 that we should address over the Mar del Plata stuff that we were examining. The main difference that we need to remember and check is that the knight could jump into g5 to e6. We always have to keep an eye on this additional option with the knight on f3. In general, I don't think it should be so scary while our pawn is on c7. But if we play c5 early, then it's a very big threat, as we'll see. Once the pawn is on c5, if white succeeds in knight e6, even as a pawn sacrifice, he has very good long-term compensation. Because after we'll have to take it, and d takes, we'll have a backward pawn on d6, and a beautiful outpost for white on d5 for his knight. Whereas if the pawn is on c7, there's no outpost because we can always play c6, and our structure is a bit more intact. This is kind of a key concept that is worth remembering and paying special attention to in the Bayonet. The positions here are quite a lot more strategic than the ones that we've examined earlier in the Mar del Plata stuff, because both sides are going to try remaining flexible for as long as possible because of this idea of the knight jump into e6. White quite likes keeping his knight on f3 for a while, and said we should try and keep ourselves flexible too, so we can react accordingly, depending on where white decides to put his pieces. So here, c5 is a threat. We don't want to allow it. So b6. Now white's main move is a4, when we'll get yet another transposition into the main line with knight e8. There are loads and loads of possible move orders that reach the main line, which we'll examine later. Alternatively, after b6, white could try moving the knight immediately, but this is going to fail to a pretty tactic. Knight e1 is the better knight move, and here we could play knight d7 or knight e8. It's a normal move. But an interesting idea that you should be aware of is c5, sacrificing the pawn on d6. Of course, the bishop can't move, so dc is obligatory, as well as even if it wasn't obligatory, we'd be quite happy now. We'll move the knight from f6 and play f5. In general, as a very loose rule of thumb here, I'm much happier to play c5 once that knight has moved from f3. This is because the knight is further away from jumping in g5 to e6, which is the big strategic risk once we played c5. Okay, here it has to be taken anyway. White can grab a pawn, but the bishop is not very good here on d6. In fact, it can't actually get out. We've got a nice knight on c6 that's jumping into d4, which is a strong outpost, and it's difficult for white to coordinate his pieces properly. But that is a better try than the other knight retreat to d2, because now c5 is even stronger. After dc, again necessary, because that bishop's trapped, knight takes. The knight gets in the way on d2, and so white can't take the pawn on d6. He has to defend this bishop, and then we've got the same trumps without actually sacrificing the pawn. We're very active, we've got a good outpost on d4, and the c4 pawn is just getting in the way of white's pieces. So bishop a3 is the main move, but it's liable to simply transpose after a b4, bishop takes b6, a4, knight e8. Just try and remember these two potential move orders. ba is giving white more options, and so I've made it as the principal line for white. Now, I think we should simply take this pawn. I've played c5 in the past, and this is how Krishchuk played against Anish Giri in a recent game. But there's one thing I don't like. If white just moves his knight around sort of as normal, then I'm happy. But if he leaves his knight on f3, it's really awkward. For example, this is how Anish played with bishop d2 and rook a3. And the problem is it's very difficult to generate any counterplay here. f5 is our intended break. But as I was mentioning earlier, with the knight still on f3, when we play f5, knight g5, followed by the pawn sacrifice knight e6, is really unpleasant. And if we can't get in f5, we can try to play h6 first, but it's still difficult, and we struggle to find any counterplay here. Therefore, I prefer not to touch the c7 pawn, leave it on c7 until white has moved this knight away from f3. Now, white has a few choices. The knight can move immediately. White's idea is to play knight b3, hitting our rook and preparing c5. So let's just move the rook away so that white doesn't gain this tempo. Now a4, knight e8 will be yet another transposition into a more main line. Whereas knight b3 prepares c5, but we can happily play it ourselves. This knight on b3 is a long, long way from the g5 square, so we're not too worried about the annoying plan of the knight being on g5. Now, our plan is simply to move the knight, probably the knight back to e8 and play f5. And so that, for example, after a4, knight e8, we're ready with f5. We have zero issues. The knight on b3 is not doing a lot. He's failed in his break with c4, c5. So taking is more critical. We recapture. And here we have two plans. One is to try and get in d5 in this sort of Moxie bind structure we have again to get rid of our backward pawn. If we succeed in that, we'll be better. We might prepare it with bishop e6. If white doesn't allow it, then the other plan is instead to push c5, except that we've got a very bad backward pawn on d6, but trust it'll be difficult to attack, especially once we have time to play knight c6 and jump our knight into this fantastic outpost on d4. The outpost of d4 will give us full compensation for our backward pawn on d6. White's trump is his past a pawn, but it's difficult to actually get it very far. It can get to a5, fine, but we control the a6 square very well with our rook on a8 and bishop on c8. So we don't need to get too worried about it. And we'll start attacking the center. Once we get our knight into d4, shift the other knight away in f5, and off we go. See a couple of examples. White has tried bishop g5 here to stop the d5 break, but we're always happy to win the dark square bishop. And in fact, white chose a slightly careless square here, putting the queen on d3, allowing the d5 break anyway, because we can exploit the a6 to f1 diagonal, and exchange bishop a6, deflecting the queen. Next, we'll take on e2 and then take the pawn on d5. We've got no problems. We've got the break in, and we're extremely comfortable. a4 would be the other approach, but we can still break in the center here. Once we've got rid of our backward d pawn, we've got no worries here either. The bishop on g7 is about to become very active too, with the e pawn being exchanged. So knight d2 is not particularly challenging. You just need to remember not to allow white to play c5. White's also tried knight e1, which is rarer because it doesn't actually attack our rook, but still the knight's coming around. We might as well drop back to d7 because the fight is about the c5 square. And once the knight has moved from f3, we're not worried about knight g5 to e6. In the main line, I recommend to go to e8 because of this worry about knight g5 to e6. But when the knight's moved, we're happy to go to d7. It's a more active square and it controls the key battleground of the c5 square. Here, white's playing very sensibly, but not putting any pressure on us. We get in our break. If white supports it, then we have a choice. c5 feels the most sensible to me. Blocking up the queen side. We're ready to play f4 and then play our caveman stuff. g5, knight f6, h5, g4, all the stuff we love to play in the King's Indian. An alternative forcing option is to take an exchange, and here we have a pretty tactic with knight f5, exploiting this long diagonal that white's got a hanging knight and a hanging rook. And after ef, e4, we actually end up in a level middle game. So if you wanted a more forcing option, that is also good. But c5 looks perfectly adequate to me. White can try bishop d2, simply trying to force away our rook. And once our rook moves, trying to get c5 in. After all, c5 is his idea. But once again, we could play c5 if we wanted. I think it's a good alternative, very solid. Black also did perfectly fine by simply taking on e4 and dropping the rook back. Now c5 isn't really possible because the d5 pawn will become vulnerable. This structure crops up a fair bit in the Bayonet, where we take on e4 and white recaptures with the knight. On the one hand, white has a very strong outpost to his knight on e4, but here the other knight isn't really helping, and we'll be able to exchange them with the knight f6. And our e7 knight, that is often very passive in these King's Indians, is ready to jump into f5 and d4, and it's got a nice outpost. The exchange of a for b pawns has helped us on the queen side. It means it's very difficult for white to sort of set up any bind on the light squares, because he's always got some issues of his own on the queen side. So this, and we have the c5 square long term as well. So this structure isn't anything to worry about in the Bayonet. It wasn't entirely necessary here, but it's also perfectly fine. Next is coming knight f5 and knight f6. being our plan. So those were the two knight jumps. In general, I think when white moves a knight from f3, there's very limited pressure on our position. The only way that white can make it challenging is to try and keep us guessing about whether he's playing for the c5 break or if he's going to go knight g5 and prevent our counterplay. White can try bishop d2 here, but it's not particularly impressive. Next move, it's interesting, but here it doesn't do a lot. White's trying to kick our rook away again, but we can just drop back to d7, keep control of the c5 square here. When the bishop is not on a great square on d2, we just drop back again. And here the simplest is just play b6, preparing to put a knight on c5. We can even consider playing knight c5 immediately. There's no need to damage our structure. After a4, knight c5, white probably drops back to defend the pawn. He can take on c5, bc to get past pawn, but that pawn's not going any further than a5. Our rook and bishop on a8 and c8 are doing a good job of defending that pawn, marching any further, and then we'll be ready to play f5 ourselves. So white defends. Now white is threatening to play a5, so we should deal with it, attack that bishop. If it drops back to a3, he's gone away from a5, or at least it'll be a pawn sacrifice now. And so we can just get on with our play with f5. Once again, we don't need to worry about knight g5 because white's moved that knight back to d2. And if bishop goes to c3, we can just hop back in again and we're fine. If white tries a5 now, then c6 works well. When after dc, knight takes, we've got two very active knights on c6 and c5, and the pawns are just getting exchanged. We're perfectly fine there. So a4 is the main move. White keeps this knight on f3, keeps us guessing. And now this is where we have a choice, but I think e8 is the easier square. Knight d7 is possible, and I've even played knight h5 as well here. Knight h5 has the advantage that you've got ideas of knight f4 and trading off for that bishop on e2. But the problem is that the knight on h5 is a bit looser. Say, after white deals with the threat of knight f4, that when we play f5, ef, gf, we've got to be worried about our knight hanging on h5. e8 is a safer square. d7 would be the most logical square, but the problem is then it's incredibly difficult to get in f5 because of knight g5 into e6 ideas. White will probably play some bishop a3 to b4 stuff again. So there are options, but I think e8 is the simplest square. Now white has an array of options here too. The main move is bishop a3, preparing to hit our rook away and play c5. But other things have been tried. Rook b1 was a really interesting but hard to believe move from Alexander Grischuk. He provokes us to play b6 to close the lines. f5 immediately is actually what Alireza played in that game, but I don't want to allow knight g5 into e6. Then we see an advantage of the rook on b1, so it's hitting the pawn on b7 after the exchange. So let's stop that first. And then bishop d2, threatening to play knight b5 and a5, so let's just get a rook out of the way. Then Alexander went rook b3 to a3. So he spent, his rook's gone from a1 to a3, but via b1, b3, a3 to provoke us into b6. But I don't think that's really worth the couple of tempi he spent. And after f5, I think our counterplay is perfectly adequate here. Of course, knight g5 needs checking, but we're in time with queen c8. This is why we started with bishop d7. So keeping a full eye on the e6 square, and next we can play h6 and hit that knight back. So rook b1 is interesting, but hard to believe. The advantage, of course, for white of forcing b6 is that we can then no longer ever really play c5, because after dc, we always want to be able to recapture b6 and control the center, control this d5 outpost. If we played b6 first and then attempt c5 after dc, we're likely just to be left with a horrible outpost for white on d5. By that reckoning, we're trying to keep as flexible as we can here. We would like to play c5, but we only want to do it once the knight is moved from f3, because then we want to play f5 without worrying about knight g5 and into e6. So we're going to play as many useful moves as we can without committing to either c5 or b6. White's going to try and force us to commit to either. So that's the reasoning behind Grishuk's rook b1. Now knight d2 is a logical looking move. White's preparing knight b3, hitting our rook and c5, as we've seen before. So we might as well retreat, again keeping the option open of whether we're going c5 or b6. After bishop a3, we're actually going to reach a main line with b6 to stop c5, knight b5, and then push with f5. Bishop b4 is the only logical move for white to get in a5, but then it's a direct transposition. An interesting move is the pawn sacrifice c5. This has never actually been played, but I saw the computer suggesting it, so we should look carefully. We grab the pawn. Now the point of the pawn sacrifice was that the knight has suddenly got a strong outpost on c4, and white is getting in a5. Here, I think bishop a6 probably equalizes, but it's not a lot of fun. So let's go knight d6 instead, exchanging off this knight. And the concrete reason why c5 is an interesting try, and the computer recommended it, is that he can now go a6. And he's got this strong passed pawn in return for his sacrificed pawn. But it is a strong passed pawn, but I don't see how it's actually getting any further. Once again, I think our bishop and rook are doing a good job of stopping that pawn. And with something like bishop d7 and knight c8, just a rock over there on the queen side, we're controlling the a7 square. So the pawn's not going any further. And I think we're ready now to play over on the king side with f5. I don't think we should encounter any problems here. Knight b3 is a logical follow-up to knight d2. But now, with the knight so far away from the e6 square, we're very happy to play c5. White could start with, normally starts with a5 or bishop d2, which come to the same thing. We should check the en passant here, another capture that's never been played, but the computer quite likes. We recapture, and we've got an odd structure again. This one, it's going to be very difficult to get in d5 compared to the last time we saw this structure. White's pieces are a bit more active, and he's got a bit more control of the d5 square. So instead, it's likely that we'll play for the c5 and knight c6 to d4 plan. For example, bishop e3. We can start with bishop a6, keeping the option of d5 open for now. After queen c2, now d5 is going to be too risky because we'll run into problems on the d file. That queen on d8. So let's go for f5 instead. And here we can actually stay as flexible as we like with this pawn on c6. At some point, we might get provoked into c5, but we don't need to rush it. White's plan is to put the knight into b6 or play bishop b6, hitting our queen. So let's skedaddle out of there. Queen c8 and queen e6. And our pieces coordinate quite well here. White's dangerous pass pawn on a5 is stuck there. Our bishop is doing a very good job of preventing it going any further. And we're ready to start pushing on the king side. For example, rook a d1, f4. The one thing to be aware of in these positions is be very careful about white sacrificing a piece if we play c5. For example, c5 now, then white might sack on c5, like knight takes either knight takes c5, recapture with other knight, take our bishop on a6, which is doing such a good job, and then push c5, and the bishop on e2 is suddenly involved in the game. Okay, he probably has to defend the pawn with bishop b6 first, so the a pawn doesn't drop. But then c5, the bishop on e2 also gets involved. Suddenly white's got two fantastic bishops and two dangerous passed pawns that we can't stop very easily. So just be careful about this piece sacrifice and don't rush in playing c5. So f4 first. And now If the bishop retreats, then c5 is fine because the bishop won't be able to go on such a fantastic square on b6 to defend this pawn on a5. And if white can't defend the pawn on a5, well, then of course the whole concept of the p sacrifice falls apart because we'll simply take the pawn. So white needs to find knight b6. Of course, these moves you don't need to remember. It's an illustrative line. We move our rook, and here the only move for white not too worse is the fantastic bishop c5, which I'd be very impressed if anyone even considers, let alone plays. Here we can just ignore it though, get on with our kingside play. And here f3, for example, opening up the f4 square for our knight to jump into, as well as our rook having some play down the f-file. Have to take, knight g6, ready to jump into f4. Every move white has to calculate what happens if we take this knight. I think now the knight is attacked because our queen has the e7 square. Apparently it's dynamically balanced, this position. It's a complete mess. Hopefully what we're playing the King's Indian 4. Also, it's almost impossible that you'll reach the position, as white played a novelty rather a long time ago. So we return to this position where DC is quite critical but has never been played. Instead, a5 or bishop d2 first in a5 is what white does. White is getting the b6 square and hoping to hop in with knight a4 to b6 at some point. But now that the knight is so far away from going to g5 and into e6, we can just push on the king side. Our play becomes very straightforward once that knight has moved from f3. If in doubt, we can switch back to our normal plan of attacking on the king side. Here again, we have a choice. Rook a6 was played in a high-level correspondence game, and black won extremely quickly. But I don't think we need to rush with rook a6. I don't see why not just play f4, followed by pushing g and h. We know this plan by now, hopefully. g5, h5, g4, probably sack the pawn with g3, and open up lines for all our pieces. If white plays knight a4, we just defend the b6 square with knight d7. White's not going any further. So I think this position after f4 is very pleasant for us. So that is the knight coming round. Bishop d2 here is more challenging once our knight is committed to e8. We don't have as many waiting moves as we'd like. And in fact, I think we might as well start with h6, just so that we say, okay, you've won. You kept your knight on f3 long enough that we're scared by knight g5. So we'll play h6, control the g5 square, but we'll play f5 next. No more of this waiting nonsense. We know what we're doing now. We're going to attack. With that, having said that, queen c2 had a concrete threat, so we need to move the rook. f5, then knight b5, hits the rook, and c5 will come with tempo because the queen is defending it. We still should slow up c5 as long as possible, but we have our own play. So a5, f5, and we're ready with the normal stuff. With the pawn already on a5, it's going to be tricky to get in c5, weakening the b6 square, and dc might be a bit more annoying. So probably what we're going to do is allow c5. With that in mind, presuming that white is going to get in c5, we want to keep our pawn on f5 for a while, play knight f6, and keep pressure on the pawn on e4. This makes it harder to get in c5 because white worries about the d5 pawn. We'll always play fe and knight takes d5. And so if white can't play c5, then it's a bit, obviously, it's hard for him to make any progress. So we'll play our waiting moves first. Don't rush with f4 here, particularly as there's no weakness to attack. We want white to commit to f3 if possible before starting the pawn storm. Instead, we're more likely to take twice on e4. For example, rook a3, knight f6, h3, and knight d7 was a nice way to reroute. Now that we're no longer worried about the knight jumping into e6 because we're controlling the g5 square, we can happily put a knight on this more active square on d7 where it controls the c5 square. h3 was a very random move. I think it was a very bad move, but it was played by a strong correspondence player. So I'm sure there's some concrete reasons. But I'd be surprised if my opponent played it. Here, it's quite hard for white actually to make any progress, whereas we can be flexible. And we can just show the following, this correspondence game, the next few moves to see how black succeeded in regrouping, putting a lot of pressure on white. Finally, found the right time to play f4, bishop f8, so increasing the control of the c5 square, as well as the usual rook round to g7, and now we're ready to start pushing. Here's g5. White might get c5 in eventually, but it's coming too slowly. We're ready already with h5, g4, and our kingside attack crashes through. So this is just a sign that this position, we can be flexible. Don't rush with f4 here, but we can get our pieces ready first. It's quite hard for white to make progress while the pawn is still on f5 because his center is a bit too weak. So after having looked at a few of the sidelines there, we'll get back into the main line with bishop a3. Now, again, c5 is possible, and it's what Krishuk played, but I prefer not to play c5 while that knight is still on f3. For the reason I explained before, that I don't want to allow knight g5 into e6 when we've already pushed the c-pawn, because white always gets fantastic compensation for the pawn there. So instead, let's stop. White's plan here is to play bishop b4 and c5, so we need to stop that. With an knight on f3, let's not do it with c5, we'll do it with b6 instead. Now white could move the knight at this point. When we're happy to play f5, there's no knight g5s, and it's simply transposes to the main line. We get this where the white starts with bishop b4, rook a8, or knight d2 first. Queen b3 is a really tricky move. White's hoping to get the position with bishop that starts with bishop b4, rook a8, and then queen b3, but not allow us to play rook b8. Therefore, we should play rook a8 with the point that after bishop b4, rook b8. This, it looks like a funny rook maneuver going to the b file that is blocked by the pawn on b6. But the point is that white can't play a5 now because he runs into trouble with this pin. So we're just slowing up white's play on the queen side. You'll see, hopefully you'll understand this a bit more once we see the line with bishop b4 first, rook a8, and then queen b3. So the main line, bishop b4, rook a8. And this is where all the trees that diverged earlier come back together again. We could have this position via white starting with ba5, rook takes, as we just saw, or white starting with bishop a3, ab, bishop takes b4, followed by a4. So the tempi could all be different depending on whether our rook has gone to a5 and back again, and if white is taken on a5. But it's exactly the same position. Now white has a few ways to try and make some progress here. It's a kind of, there is some waiting here. We want to play f5, but we always have to judge correctly whether knight g5 is an issue. It's much, much less of an issue when our pawn is still on c7, because white doesn't have this outpost on d5, and we don't have the backward pawn on d6. Meanwhile, white is going to desperately try and break through with a5 to get rid of our pawn, and c5. He can do it immediately with a5, but we have an important resource here that is very useful to remember with this setup with the knight on e8. You can see this is a huge advantage to dropping back to e8 rather than putting the knight on h5 or d7. So we can play c5. And we see that after dc, knight takes, our knight is controlling the d6 pawn. If white just moves the bishop, then we simply take the pawn on a5. So the only way to try and bishop a3, knight to a5, only way to try and justify falling for our trap by playing a5 there is to play queen d5, but bishop b7 renews the threat on the bishop and pawn. White can try a6 to deflect us, but after the exchange, the pawn on a6 might look scary, but this queen is actually trapped on b7. Queen a7, knight c6 is good game queen. So the only thing white can do is actually play a7. We take the queen, a8 queen, but all these time is lost a pawn. So this trap of a5, c5 is incredibly useful to know. And I imagine that your opponents could easily fall for it. So keep it in mind. Queen b3 was Ding Liren's choice. He's preparing a5. Now c5 won't work because the bishop is defended, or at least won't be so strong. But Rajabov chose rook b8 to discourage a5. This is the line I was talking about with the subtlety of playing queen b3 before bishop b4. But we can still get this position. Now, if the queen moves out of the way, we could just repeat with rook a8. Still, I think a5 is going to be too hard to play because of c5 and knight takes c6, when we'll just pick up that a5 pawn. So I don't think white actually has a better move than queen b3, and we're just repeating position. We can also just get on with it with f5 on the king side. Hello, a5, but after some exchanges, put pressure on that knight and then jump the other knight into f5. This position could be unpleasant if white could magically put the bishop on a5 to g5 with this pin to try and maintain a knight on e4. But here, I think we're fine. The knight's coming into d4, and it's quite difficult for white to actually make any more progress. We're not in any particular bind on the queen side, so I think it's just comfortable equality. Knight b5 was Ding Liren's choice, when f5 is obviously coming with greater speed because e4 is undefended. White could try plowing on, but it'll actually just come to the same thing. This position will be reached by the other move order as well. Knight d2, we take, opening up the line for our knight to join the game. Knight f5. White succeed in a5. It's not the end of the world. This is quite a typical structure. Knight gets into d4, exploiting the pin. We're still following the Ding Liren game. If the queen goes back to d1, then queen h4 looks good, hitting the knight on e4, activating with tempo. He went to d3, but then the pin with bishop f5, and Rajabov was fine. Knight f6 is becoming a big threat with the pin, particularly, especially if white exchanges knights on d4, so that there's no pressure on the c7 pawn. So our pieces are very active here, and we've equalized. Queen b3 is still quite a sophisticated move, and one of white's better tries. Knight d2 falls to a similar trap. I was saying that c5 wasn't any good once we played b6, but here it is very strong because white's pieces are not very well placed. If white just retreats, then f5, and we can even play bishop h6, activating this bishop. White's bishop is misplaced on a3, and we've got a very good version of the classical lines with knight bd7. That once we got the c5 in, white's not getting any further on the queen side, and we're ready on the king side. Just remember not to play f4 too early here. Let's keep pressure on the e4 pawn for as long as possible. Once white plays f3, you can consider playing f4 and getting the pawn storm. But the pawn storm doesn't work if white's not played f3, generally. Some unique circumstances, perhaps, it's still doable, but in general, I would be very reluctant to push f5, f4 if white hasn't played f3. I should point out that Magnus Carlsen himself chose f5 here, and check out the model game Pogosyan against Magnus Carlsen to see his handling of the King's Indian. But the point is, after c5 here, white's pieces are just too passive. The d6 pawn is safely guarded, and our knight is ready to hop into d4. Here, the pawns on c4 and a2, c4 and a4, sorry, are very weak, and at least as weak as ours on b6 and d6. We're nice and active, and we shouldn't have any problems here. Ready to play bishop e6 next. So that is knight d2, where we can also play c5. But it's kind of a very unusual circumstance, that one. It's just because after knight d2, white's pieces are all uncoordinated for a move. White can also play some waiting moves. Rook e1 is possible, but not particularly challenging. But I guess it's just generally a logical move to develop a piece, but we can get on with it with f5. And knight g5 isn't particularly challenging here because we can ignore it with knight f6 and knight e6. We'll just lose a pawn. We'll take it and go queen c8 and take this pawn on e6. Long term, the pawn is just dropping. Once again, I'll reiterate, if the pawn is on c5, we're scared because white got the outpost on d5. But if he doesn't have that outpost, then we're not too worried. It still needs checking, but generally we're fine. a5 would be a more thematic way of continuing. But we simply exchange, put some pressure on the pawn on e4. Bishop takes c7 isn't working because we take the rook on a1, hitting the queen. So that tactic doesn't work out for white. And otherwise, again, we can do this f takes e4, activate both our knights. And the knight's ready to hop into d4. This is another common type of position that we'll see in the bayonet. So that was rook e1, kind of not too challenging move. Queen d3 is a useful waiting move. It's been played in quite a lot of correspondence chess. White's preparing to play various moves. Knight d2, for example. Probably a5 can still be met by c5, but it's a useful waiting move as well. Connecting the rooks. The rook might come across to b1. But we can just play our f5 break. Now white goes a5. c5 is, I don't think, well, it doesn't work for concrete reasons here because after c5, dc, knight takes, there's queen d5 check. But generally there are concrete reasons that c5 doesn't work once we played f5, just because our king becomes a bit more vulnerable. But on the other hand, we've gained a tempo with our attack with f5. So we can simply take it. Now this time, don't play knight f6 because bishop takes c7 does work. After we take on a1, we're not attacking white's queen. So keep the knight on e8 and just we can activate the bishop. Black's next moves were king h8, knight g8 to f6. When we were fully coordinated, I'm very happy. Just keep the knight on e8 for the time being, not to allow any bishop takes c7 trick. We can take back with the knight, defend the rook on a8. So the main move is knight b5, preparing a5 without allowing the c5 trick, because after dc knight takes, our pawn on d6 will be hanging. So it's time to play f5. Now Vichy played a5 once, ignoring it, and therefore people have repeated it because Vichy played it. But I think he might mix something up. I don't think a5 here is very good. We can take the pawn. And actually there's a bit of a problem here for white. g5 is the most active square, dreaming of maybe jumping into e6 one day, as well as attacking the pawn on e4. But concretely, it fails to e3, exchange knight f5 when we attack the knight and throw knight to e3. Probably next move, when the knight moves somewhere, we'll take on a5 first and then take the pawn on e3, just to prevent any counterplay with ab. Knight d2 is the other way to recapture the pawn. Here we can also play e3 and knight f5 with similar ideas, but even stronger is to play c6. I should point out c5 was actually played in Anand Shirov, but I think c6 is stronger because it's more forcing. Now white has to play what would be, or what was the en passant in the game after c5 dc, because the knight is attacked. Whereas in the game after c5, moving the bishop was an interesting idea too. So take, it comes to the same thing. Now we're attacking the bishop and the pawn on a5. After bishop c3, we could take on a5, which is what Shirov did, but I think we might as well defend this pawn on e4 first. Now we're threatening to take the pawn on a5. Our pieces are very active, and I don't think we should have any concerns here either. We're a pawn up as well. So that was Vichy's try of a5. We should check knight g5. This check is, we should always check this jump when we play f5, but here it's not worrying. White succeeds in his knight jump. Especially, this is a line, this is an idea that crops up time and time again in the bayonet of jumping the knight into e6 in other lines. So some people can do it on autopilot, but here it's not really very effective. The pawn on e6 is just a weakness, and white doesn't have a corresponding outpost to go with it. Like we're already 1 pawn up and we're likely to win a second. So knight g5 doesn't work. Instead, white should come back to d2 to defend the pawn. Now, bishop d7 is just a useful waiting move. We're preparing for white playing a5. But we're going to have some tactics, as you'll see. Now, white generally does play a5. Hard to know what he does otherwise. But if he waits, we can play knight f6 and put more pressure on his center. So a5, we take it. And now white has a choice. He takes with the rook. He gives us a choice. We can exchange and play queen a8, which should be enough to equalize. If white takes on c7 with a bishop, then bishop takes b5 wins material, because the bishop isn't defended anymore, so it has to go back. Or we can keep more life in the position with rook b8, when we're starting to threaten c6 and exploit the fact that this clump of pieces are not that coherent. White can push c5. He's threatening c6, blocking out our bishop, so it's time to get rid of it. And then king h8 is a nice tidying move. We've got a couple of different plans. We're threatening maybe just to take on c5 here and play knight d6 with a solid position, or the usual plan of knight f6 and attacking on the king side. White's position might look impressive, but it's hard for him actually to get any further. And the two bishops aren't actually very well placed on b4 and b5. There are a lot of tactics he has to avoid. In his center, the pawn e4 is very loose. Instead, bishop takes a5 is more ambitious, but much riskier. We take on e4. Now taking back is the most natural move. Knight c3 was actually played successfully in one game. But here we have the same idea we saw earlier with e3. We saw this with the knight over on g5. It's a strong discombobulating move, just weakening white's control of the center. Now white can't actually stop our knight landing in on e3, e4, knight e3, exchange. Next will come queen g5 with a lot of pressure on white's king side already. The bishop on a5 is just offside here. But after white recaptures, we've got a trick and play rook takes a5 and c6. And we're attacking both the rook and the knight. What white should do here is move the rook or defend the rook, allow cb. But I think we can be happy with our two pieces for rook and pawn here. If white tries dc, then bishop takes is even worse for white. Now we're attacking the knight on e4 as well as the queen. So we're going to have two pieces for rook. White won't even get the pawn, and we're doing extremely well. So this wraps up the coverage of the bayonet. Hopefully you'll believe me now when I say that it's not as scary as its reputation. There's a strategic battle where these subtleties you have to remember, such as not playing c5 and f5 when white can go knight g5 into e6, and therefore delaying c5 if the white knight is still on f3, and probably play with b6 instead. Then we have these tricks that are worth remembering with c5 followed by dc knight takes, exploiting the bishop hanging on b4 to win the pawn on a5, and just staying flexible with b6 or c5 on the queen side, and timing f5 correctly to make sure the knight g5 into e6 isn't scary. Thanks a lot for watching, and see you again soon. Cheers.